Hello and welcome to this edition of Agenda. I'm Ewan Gorn. A commemoration of the voyage of the Odin's Raven will be held this coming Tynwald Day. It's the 40th anniversary of the expedition where a Manx and Norwegian crew sailed the replica Viking longship between Trondheim and Peel to celebrate the millennium year of the Manx Parliament. On this episode of Agenda, I speak to the president of Tynwald, Steve Rodan, and the mastermind of the Odin's Raven voyage, Robin Bigland.
I name this ship Odin's Raven. A fair wind to the ship, success and prosperity to her brave and valiant crew, to bring her safely to the Isle of Man.
You just heard the voice of the Lady Paul, wife of the then Lieutenant Governor, in 1979 as the Odin's Raven, a 2/3 scale replica of the famous Viking Gokstad ship, launched out of Trondheim, setting out to arrive in Peel on Tynwald Day. It was masterminded and funded by local businessman Robin Bigland, who was part of the 16-strong crew, which sailed more than 2,500 kilometres on a journey which featured narrowly missed storms, a capsizing vessel, no shortage of whiskey from friendly folk on the way, and of course, a triumphant reception on arrival in Peel. I spoke to Mr. Bigland and asked him if this was the last hurrah for the Raven's legacy.
Well, I think we used to have fairly regular meetings, dinners and things, on the anniversary. And I thought at 30 years it was probably time that we drew stumps because, well, for a start, one or two of the crew members were no longer with us. And it is indeed the case that nowadays we're 5 members of the crew short out of a crew of 16. So this really is, I think, our last hurrah. I think there is a danger with all these sort of concepts that you can go on having anniversaries for almost too long. So, yeah, this will be very much the last hurrah.
What are your feelings when you meet up with the old crew members? I'm sure you'll be meeting them on Tynwald Day to sort of talk through your voyage with dignitaries assorted. But what's it like meeting back up with the crew?
Well, I do see certain members of the crew from time to time. The Norwegian crew members, of whom there were 5, again, are dwindling, unfortunately. But it's simply that old memories are, as always with reunions, I'm sure that you probably go to, school or university reunion, and you see a lot of old faces there, and everyone's grown a bit older and whatever. But perhaps old Vikings never die, you never know, but unfortunately they do, actually.
Well, you were bonded by a remarkable journey, which was well documented by media at the time. Revisiting that, do you think it is an important thing to do, to highlight what happened?
Well, in this instance, it's not so much that I thought it was a good idea. I think it was that I was approached via Tynwald to the effect that they would like to celebrate the fact that it was 40 years since we did the voyage. So it wasn't actually the crew per se, or me in particular, that decided it was a good idea, because I think, as I told you, I was sort of drawn stumps 30 or 10 years ago. But no, this is an invitation from Tynwald. The point about Odin's Raven was that it was symbolic of 1,000 years of parliamentary history. I think any nation would be extremely keen to celebrate that. Imagine what the Americans would make of it. So, yes, it is something to celebrate. The ship is, as you know, in the House of Manannan, albeit in a tableau form rather than in the form that she was in when we had her in the old railway shed, as it were, in Peel, where many people visited her and very much took on board, if that's the right expression, the concept of the voyage.
Take us back. When did the idea strike you? Where were you? Do you remember what the thought process was? And you thought, this is something I want to do.
Yes, I do. I was talking to some friends, having lunch one time, and I observed that probably the right thing to do in order to celebrate the fact that this Tynwald was the surviving relic of the Norwegian Thingvellir or Tynwald or whatever, the meeting place in the field, in other words, which was more of a law-giving assembly where law was given out, and that evolved, as we all know, into the concept that is today known as Parliament. That is an unbroken succession, effectively, and we do have the oldest standing Parliament in the world. The Icelandic people have a similar concept, which is somewhat older in origin than ours, but unfortunately was broken by circumstance, whereas ours has continued.
When did the idea form, I suppose, that this was how you would mark this milestone?
Rather like all ideas, it just does form. Look, effectively, I think it was the fact that I had always nurtured a curiosity as to how my own forebears came from Norway a very long time ago, so around about 980 odd, from a place called Bigland, which is in Setesdal in Norway. And because the family had kept up its connections with Norway, indeed my great-grandfather was asked by the then rector of Bigland if, well, the rector said, I hope you don't mind me tapping out parishioners who left about 900 years ago, but would you be prepared to stump up a few quid because the church is in need of repair, which I thought was pretty smart on his part anyway. So these things do happen. And the connection is there, and I have tried to keep some sort of connection up. Yeah, I did become the Norwegian consul here.
What did people say to you when you told them that this is what you wanted to do? Was there any initial scepticism of how you would proceed, or was everybody fully on board, if you forgive the pun, straight away?
I should imagine there was a whole lot of scepticism when people come up with the idea. But I mean, I didn't put it about, as it were, until such time as I was aware, through going over to Norway, fortunately through the help of many other people, enlisting the aid of a firm of a very small family business, really, in a place called Onsøy in Engelsvik, near Oslo, who could build such a boat. And certainly they could and did. So that, I mean, I needed to be sure that all of those sort of things, and equally that we had enough time. I mean, there was only a year in which to do all the things of building the boat, training the crew. But again, I was very lucky because I happened to know somebody who at that time commanded the Special Boat Section of Royal Marines, and I rang him and he said, oh yeah, straight up our street.
And much has been documented of the experience of that training. If you could describe the feeling of floating around in a state of undress in cold waters, what would you say it was like?
If I can use the expression, bollock naked. The reason really was that everything we had to do was to be done in front of everybody else in the crew, obviously, because there's no cover, it's a rowing boat. So in order to get over that problem, they told us that we should, in fact, train naked, because that got over any embarrassment that people might feel about, because you were concentrating on the training and getting the job done. And so, I mean, the fact you were doing it naked was really irrelevant. I don't suppose that galley slaves bothered much about the fact that they were naked when they were changed, when they just got on with rowing. So, I mean, it was just a sensible thought because, you understand that all bodily functions and things have to be completed in front of other people. But if you don't make sure that, you keep yourself okay in that respect, you'll get ill. So, I mean, we were 31 nights at sea. So, I mean, you have to be sure that you train properly, and nobody better than the SBS to do that and train you.
So when you set off, did the romance fall away quite quickly and you sort of turned into mission mode, if you will, and started focusing on what you had to do?
You're damn right it fell away quickly because no sooner had we got down the fjord from Trondheim to the open sea, we got about 20 miles out. And the only vessel we saw, really, on the voyage practically, because we were very low in the water, you don't see very far, was a fishing boat that came across to us, offered us some fish, and told us that they had a couple of sister ships that were making haste to get back to a place called Öresund, around Stad Point, and because there was a very large storm coming, and we were heading straight into it. So we didn't know that was the case, albeit we'd taken obviously we tried to get some weather condition information. But, I mean, things were not like they are today. You couldn't just use your whatever equipment, such as we have today. I mean, all we had was a compass, which is basically what the Vikings had, in effect. They had a lodestone that would point north. And anyway, we hurried into Öresund and rode out, able to ride out the storm there, but it was a serious one. So yes, I mean, we were pretty quickly disabused of any romantic visions of sailing into the sunset and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, great. Later, things did get somewhat better, but we had a pretty wet voyage in many cases, and you are wet, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to get on with it.
Do you remember any moments where a sort of stillness came about the crew or yourself and you could reflect on what you were doing? And
Well, indeed, simply because during the night time, the reason we travelled at night a lot was in order to get very close to the next place where we were going to be met and greeted. And, it had been arranged in principle, let's say, turn up at 10 o'clock or something in the morning. Well, you can't just travel a couple of 100 miles and then turn up at 10 o'clock kind of stuff. You have to get there first and then row around the headland or sail around the headland or something and be there, which is what we did. So our sailing would be done at night very much. But having said that, bear in mind that in those latitudes, you get what the Shetlanders call the simmerdim, which is twilight really. So that was a big help. And yes, naturally one had a chance to reflect and take in the beauty of our surroundings, certainly, when it wasn't raining or foggy. So, yeah.
And I've heard it described that one could say it was the least conventional pub crawl you've ever heard of. Would that be an unfair or a fair description? Because there was definitely, wherever you went, there seemed to be a real appreciation for what you were doing and help and gifts and things of this nature.
Yeah. Well, the Scottish Islands undoubtedly have a very strong history, memory, if you will, of the history of the islands. And the islands were particularly important to the Vikings and were, in many cases, strongholds, just as this island became the centre of that for obvious reasons because of its geographical location. And that's why it became what it is, a kingdom, because he who controlled this island basically controlled almost all of certainly the Irish Sea, giving him access, or giving them access, to England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. So that was very important. Naturally, for reasons of that nature, if you were a Viking, you were travelling in that sort of area. You had certain places where you knew you could be received reasonably well, others where you were very much an invader. And if you turned up in the wrong spot, you would get bombarded with missiles and stones and probably have what the Vikings called a strandhog, which is a battle on the beach. And many ships were lost as the result of adverse weather because obviously it's a rocky coast and, there's nobody around to help you, as it were.
You weren't chased off, though, at any point?
Far from it. Yes, I know your point about the pub crawl business. Naturally, there was a good deal of generosity in the reception, and whiskey and things would flow copiously. But the point was that we did have a job to do, and the crew knew that they must get out and get on with it.
And deadline, yeah.
Yeah, look, and also you can't afford to take significant liberties in that respect. You've got 16 men on a small vessel. She was only 50 foot long with 11 foot 7 in the beam, and she drew 22 inches of freeboard there. You don't get it wrong. You've got to know what you're doing. And you have to work very carefully as a crew, and so you can't go lumbering about as a drunk. It'll sober you up pretty quick because if you wind up in the sea. Although yes, we trained for as much time as possible to get back, but you can't. That boat is not a very manoeuvrable vessel, and it takes quite a long time to get back to the point where you might have lost somebody overboard. They're drifting wherever it might be. You can't see very far because you're so low in the water. A body in a wave trough, even if it's only 50, 60 feet away, you probably wouldn't see it, right? Okay, maybe some shouting, but it depends on the wind. All these issues, say if you got overboard for some reason and you weren't paying attention and you just got, then, there was a hell of a good chance you were going to drown. It was as simple as that. In those days, there were sort of health and safety issues. And we weren't wearing life jackets all the time and stuff. You couldn't. To work the boat, you have to, to be limber and agile. So that was it. Those were the problems.
And you did capsize. What was the thinking when that was happening? Was it, oh no, this is all ruined, or was it very calm?
We had trained exhaustively for calamities of various kinds. It was pretty sure that something would happen during the voyage. A long way. In that vessel we covered thick end of 2,000 miles by the time we finished our training and the voyage and so on. Anyway, we had trained for it. When it happened, it was in the sound of Rase, which is the Coolin Hills up there, sort of sky. Effectively, the wind comes down off the hill, rolls down, hits the water, whips across it, At one moment you may be, as we were, in arms, as they call it. In other words, you're not travelling, you're not moving, or very little, you took very little way, and then suddenly, bang, a gust hits you. Well, I mean, the Vikings were aware of this, and I do remember reading in one of the sagas a passage where it said we rowed because of field conditions. Well, that is exactly what they meant by field conditions, although you learn, in our case, the hard way. And when this wind spill shifts across and it hits you, and the boat heels, which naturally she does, it's a rowing boat. There's no scuppers. The water doesn't run anywhere except it stays in the boat. Therefore, as soon as the weight of the water brings the boat down, shall we say, 10, 15 degrees in our case, and she's over bream water, over gunwale, you're going to capsize, and that's it. So, end of story. When that happened to the Vikings, unless they happened, fortunately, to be in a friendly area, they would be undoubtedly, either they would be washed ashore and smashed on the rocks, or if somebody found them, they would almost certainly kill them.
But you were very lucky that the people of Skye, I believe, went out to search for your belongings and
yes,
help.
They did. Oh yes, I mean, we were given every possible encouragement and help. I mean, they couldn't have been more helpful to us. Everywhere we went, the reception was huge. Their memory was, as I say, very strong of the days. In fact, there was an amusing anecdote. We were on Mull, an old fellow we were chatting to, and he said that he'd been down a few evenings previously, and there was another elderly man sort of staring out to sea, leaning on the railing. And he said to him, by way of a sort of conversation, did you know the Vikings are coming? And this man turned and faced him, and he said his face looked horror-stricken. And he said there was a waxy pallor on it. And he looked at me and he said, good God, not again.
Was the deadline of arriving on Tynwald Day, was that ever in doubt?
I mean, in doubt, yes, because you never know what's going to happen. But again, we understood the plan. We were Port Patrick the evening before, and we sailed down during the night and arrived pretty early, in fact. It was a lovely day, it was beautiful weather, and it was a lovely voyage home. Arrived in Peel Bay and made preparations for the reception that did occur, which was due to take place about 6 o'clock, I think, in the evening. Amusingly, my wife had rung the police station and asked about parking facilities, and the person to whom she spoke said, oh, don't worry, Mrs. Bigland, it's tea time, there won't be many people. There were about 20,000. Oh dear. The whole beach was... And the area that would have been sort of roped off was for us to land. And I was to present the bishop with a piece of Trondheim Cathedral, which in fact had been given to me by the Bishop of Trondheim, and had not been lost in the capsize, thank God. And I, carried this on a short ceremony. Well, of course, there were so many people around, it was almost impossible. Small fingers on my sword and things like that,
What was the feeling amongst the crew when you landed? Was there a relief?
I think it's of course, enormous joy at seeing families again. Relief, yes, because like any return voyage, you're always relieved when the event has happened and you're safe and you're back and the things that you sought to do have been achieved. I mean, that's the point. That's where the relief. I mean, in personal terms, I was extremely relieved because, if we had such an accident that I referred to earlier and somebody had gone overboard, just let's say they drowned, it would have been a disaster and the whole voyage would have ended in disaster in that context. So yes, profound relief, to be frank. That boat's design is 1,000 years old. It's all the things that you look for, and you alluded to the romanticism as a concept and so on. But the Vikings had built a warboat, and that is a warboat. Long ships came in all sorts of different guises. Some of them were effectively transport, they're cargo vessels. You put animals on them, and they did, and some of them were somewhat covered and things of this kind. But this is a warboat, and she was about the smallest warboat that they would normally bring, a crew of 16 to 20 people, something like that, in the knowledge that in the course of the voyage you would probably lose some crewmen, but you'd take some slaves, because slaving was a big thing the Vikings did, and you'd put them to work on the oars as well, and that sort of stuff. So, yes, it's different things to different people, of course, but fundamentally it's that huge relief, certainly joy that you're back with your family on, and a sense of an achievement, certainly, and the feeling that you had done something that was memorable. And I think the fact that Odin's Raven is visited and seen by a lot of people today is something of importance. It is perhaps the only millennium symbol left. There is no other symbol of the millennium, and so she is indeed symbolic of that.
Do you think it's important that we continue to recognise the links between the Isle of Man and Norway, the links between our parliaments? Do you think it's important that continues, and would you like to see, perhaps in 1,000 years' time, whatever, something similar happen again?
I mean, Lord knows where we'll be 1,000 years, but in answer to your primary question, the links between this island and Norway are indeed strong. There were, as you probably know, 12 Viking kings of Man. The history of this island is inextricably linked with the Vikings, and our seat of government has exactly that heritage. And of course, it's immensely strong. In fact, indeed, in the Middle Ages, it was the case that this island was sometimes referred to as Norway because of the fact that it had a rather difficult relationship between the King of England and the King of Norway. Whoever it was who was alleged King of Man had to box pretty clever to keep both sides on side, as it were. And in history, as you well know, there are events where things went pretty sadly wrong. But I mean, yes, the link is very strong. I know from my time as Norwegian consul, it is very strong. And the Norwegians certainly retain that sense of kinship and relationship. And indeed, there will be every year at Tynwald representatives from the Stortinget and other things, which kindles that relationship and keeps it alive.
And now it's a matter of 30 yards. They're rowing well. I can see Robin Bigland, the chieftain, there. Eddie Cacken aboard there too. And she's almost touching Manx soil. The oars are going. The cheers are going up here at Peel. And Odin's Raven rowing as strongly as when she left Trondheim 37 days ago. And they are on Manx soil.
That was Manx Radio's commentary provided by Peter Neal as the Odin's Raven arrived in Peel in 1979, greeted by 20,000 people. And before that, the mastermind behind the whole journey, Robin Bigland. You're listening to Agenda on Manx Radio. Well, to mark the occasion of the epic voyage, Tynwald members and dignitaries will gather at the House of Manannan, where the vessel is now on display, to be joined by the surviving members of the crew. I spoke to the president of Tynwald, Steve Rodan, who explained to me how the decision to mark this 40th anniversary of the voyage was made.
We realised last year that it was a very important anniversary in 2019 on Tynwald Day. Not only was it the millennium year when the Queen Lord of Man presided, but we had the arrival in Peel of the Odin's Raven after an epic voyage from Trondheim in Norway to Peel. And this was very much part of the Millennium celebrations in 1979. And my good friend, member of Tynwald, Martin Perkins, reminded me, because I'd certainly had forgotten about this important anniversary, that wouldn't it be a great idea if we could get as many of the surviving crew together as we could to mark the event on Tynwald Day itself. So we, the committee behind the scenes, and we had discussion with Robin Bigland, who was the mastermind for what was an epic voyage in 1979. We've put together a commemorative event to take place at the House of Manannan on the evening of Tynwald Day, where the surviving crew members are meeting up, some of them coming from Europe, especially for the event, and that we can recount that epic voyage.
Of course, the House of Manannan is where the Odin's Raven is at the moment.
Well, absolutely the right place to mark this event, because the replica Viking longship, which is Odin's Raven and which was sailed by a crew of Manx and Norwegian volunteers, is very much an integral part of the House of Manannan, as is the new Kingdom of Man gallery, which has a lot of important Viking era artifacts on display. We're going to take advantage of the fact that Professor Andrew MacDonald, who has launched a book, or about to launch a book called The Sea Kings, which studies the late Norse kingdom of Man and the Isles in the period of the 10, 11, 1200s, when, of course, the Isle of Man was the centre of a vast maritime kingdom of Man and the Isles, the Sudreys, and it's to that time, of course, that we trace the Norse origins of Tynwald itself. Tynwald, Thingvellir, assembly field, dates way back to that time. So it's highly appropriate that we reflect on our Norse origins by commemorating the epic Odin's Raven voyage, which itself marked the millennium of Tynwald.
And we always have representatives from Norway, I believe, attending Tynwald Day. And I know we'll find out probably exactly who they are in future, but is it important to retain that link and ensure that we do have a representative from our very closely related Parliament, if you will?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, this year we are being joined by official guests at this event, and of course for Tynwald Day itself, guests from Iceland. We have the speaker from the Icelandic Parliament, the Althing as our guest. We have the Vice President of the Norwegian Parliament, the Storting. We have the member of the Westminster Parliament for Orkney and Shetland attending, and that's very good because it was their communities, certainly in Norway and Orkney and Shetland, who gave shelter, assistance and rest to the crew during their expeditions. So we hope their presence will reinforce and strengthen our own heritage and the links with these particular nations.
When we think about the Odin's Raven, some of the images show the thousands and thousands of people who turned out to welcome it as it entered Peel. What would you give to have that kind of number for a celebration of Parliament?
My goodness, I think it was something like 20,000 appeared for the arrival of Odin's Raven on the quayside at Peel. And there was, of course, film taken of the event, and we're hoping to put out some of the original footage of the arrival on that day in 1979 during the commemoration itself. But my goodness, it really struck a chord, didn't it, in Millennium Year to have such a fantastic event, which nobody really knew would this work or not, this undertaking, which Mr. Bigland conceived in 1978. He asked for volunteers.
The president of Tynwald, Steve Rodan. That's all from this episode of Agenda. We'll be back with more from the programme next week, and you can listen again to this episode online as a podcast. But for now, Guramayu and goodbye.